Close your eyes if you like. You will not need them for this. Settle into wherever you are right now and let your shoulders fall a little, because what I want to tell you tonight does not need your eyes. It needs only your attention, and even that can come and go as it pleases. I am glad you are here. There was a time long before anything we would recognize as history, when the human story very nearly did not happen at all. Not a war that could have gone differently, not an empire that might have lasted another century. Something further back than that and stranger. A point so narrow, so fragile, that for tens of thousands of years our entire ancestral population may have numbered only in the low thousands, scattered and struggling somewhere in ancient Africa. Not a nation, not even a large town by modern measure. A population small enough that a single bad season repeated often enough could have ended the whole experiment of being human before it had properly begun. This is not a metaphor. Geneticists who study the deep patterns hidden inside human deoxyribonucleic acid have found something that looks very much like a bottleneck. A long stretch of time when our ancestors came astonishingly close to vanishing. No statues mark it. No ruins survive from it. There is no battlefield to visit, no palace to walk through, no inscription carved into stone. The only record left behind is written inside us in the quiet mathematics of our own inherited code, passed down so faithfully that scientists can now read echoes of a crisis that no one alive at the time could have understood as a crisis at all. I find that almost unbearably moving, if I'm honest with you. Every person you've ever loved, every stranger who has ever annoyed you in traffic, every person currently asleep on every continent of this turning planet carries inside their cells a faint signature of a moment when there were perhaps only a few thousand of us left. We do not know their names, we never will, but we know in a fairly precise scientific sense that they were there and that they held on. Tonight I want to walk you gently through that story, not to alarm you, the opposite actually. There is something deeply calming about understanding just how fragile our beginnings truly were, and how against long odds the thread did not break. I think there is a kind of comfort in knowing that the human species has already survived its own near ending once quietly without ceremony, long before anyone could write the story down. Before we go any further, I want to invite you to settle in properly for what is ahead. If this is the kind of history you find yourself drawn to, the kind told slowly, with care and without unnecessary noise, it helps enormously if you take a moment to follow along and let others know you are here, perhaps with a small, like on your way past. It costs you nothing. And it tells me you would like more evenings like this one. I'm always curious where this story finds people, so if you feel like it, leave a note about where you are listening from tonight and what brought you to a story like this one. I read those more often than you might expect. For now though, get comfortable. Pull the blanket up if you have one. We have a long evening together, and I would rather you arrive slowly than rush in. So let us go back, further than the pyramids, further than agriculture, further than the first cave paintings of bison and horses flickering by torchlight. We are heading toward a window of time that researchers now place somewhere in the broad stretch between 900,000 and 800,000 years ago, deep within an era we call the early to middle Pleistocene. The world looked different then. The climate moved through long grinding cycles of cold and warmth, ice sheets advancing and withdrawing, like slow breathing across the northern half of the planet while in Africa. Where our story is centered tonight, the land itself was shifting in quieter, equally consequential ways. Picture it if you can, without picturing anything too vivid or violent. Just stillness and distance and time moving slowly enough that a single human life would have felt almost unchanging from birth to death. Wide grasslands giving way to denser woodland, in places rivers that swelled and shrank with the seasons. And somewhere within that landscape are small bands of early human ancestors moving in rhythm with the land around them. Not the species we are today, Not Homo sapiens as we would recognize ourselves, but ancestors close enough in the unbroken chain that what happened to them happened eventually to us. These were not helpless creatures clinging to survival in some cartoonish sense. They used stone tools shaped with real skill. They understood fire in some capacity or were moving toward understanding it. They tracked animals, read weather-past knowledge, between generations the only way available to them, by watching, by repeating, by surviving long enough to teach someone younger. Their lives were by every reasonable measure full. Ordinary in the way that any life lived day by day is ordinary to the person living it. There is no reason to believe they felt themselves to be standing at the edge of anything. Scholars still debate exactly how aware any hominin population of this era could have been of long-term decline, since awareness of slow change is difficult even for us with our calendars and records. They simply lived, hunted, gathered, raised children, buried their dead in whatever fashion their culture allowed, watched the sky, and yet underneath that ordinary rhythm, something was beginning to go quietly and visibly wrong. Not a single dramatic event, nothing you could point to on a single day and say, here, this is where it started. The evidence remains incomplete on precisely what combination of forces set this in motion, but the most widely accepted reconstruction points toward a slow tightening of environmental conditions, a planet shifting in ways that made the margins of survival narrower than they had been before. Food sources that had once been reliable became less so. Ranges that had once supported many small groups began perhaps to support fewer. None of this would have felt like an ending while it was happening. It would have felt like simply living through a harder stretch of years, the kind every generation believes is temporary. We will spend the rest of this evening tracing exactly how that hard stretch became something far more severe, how a population already small by any modern standard grew smaller still until our ancestors stood almost unknowingly at the very edge of disappearing altogether. We will look at what the genetic record actually shows, how scientists go about reading a crisis that left no bones to count and no graves to excavate in any conventional sense. We will sit with the uncomfortable, strangely beautiful fact that the very existence of every person you will ever meet depended on a population so small that by certain calculations it could have fit inside a single modern stadium. But that is a story for the night to unfold slowly the way every good story should. For now, just know this. Somewhere in that ancient African landscape under skies that have long since changed their pattern of stars, a small group of our ancestors was living through the early edge of the hardest stretch their kind had ever faced. They did not know they were near the edge of everything. They simply kept going one season at a time, the way people always have. Stay with me a little longer. There is more to this story, and it only grows more remarkable from here. Let me take you deeper into the texture of that world, because the people we are speaking of deserve more than a passing glance before their crisis begins in earnest. Their world was not empty. It only looks that way from this distance, the way a photograph of an old house can look still and silent even though it once held the noise of an entire family. Across the African landscape of this period, small bands moved through territory that shifted with the seasons following, herds following, water following whatever the land was willing to offer in a given year. Anthropologists who study this era estimate that group sizes were likely modest. Perhaps a few dozen individuals at most within any single band related by blood and by necessity dependent on each other in ways that modern life rarely demands of us anymore. There was no surplus to fall back on, no granary, no stored harvest, no neighbouring village to trade with when local resources thinned. Whatever the land gave that season was in a very real sense the whole of what they had. It is worth sitting with how intelligent these people likely were, because there is a tendency when we picture anything this far back in time to imagine something closer to instinct than to thought. That impression does not hold up well against the evidence. The stone tools recovered from sites of this general period show real technical skill, a deliberate shaping of material that required planning, patience, and an understanding of how stone fractures under controlled pressure. This was not trial and error, performed once and forgotten. It was knowledge refined and passed down, the kind of inherited skill that only survives when someone takes the time to teach it to someone younger. Whatever else was happening to this population, a loss of intelligence was almost certainly not among their problems. What was beginning to change slowly and without any single dramatic turning point was the world around them. Here is where the picture grows genuinely interesting and a little uncomfortable, because the deeper cause behind the decline we are tracing tonight is still not something scientists can describe with full certainty. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a flaw in the research. It is simply the nature of trying to reconstruct a slow-moving crisis from a period with almost no direct physical record to draw from. What we have instead is something more indirect, and in its own way more remarkable. We have the genome itself, read like a kind of long, faint diary carrying patterns that only become visible when researchers compare the deoxyribonucleic acid of people living today against careful mathematical models of population size, generation after generation stretched backward across hundreds of thousands of years. This is where I want to slow down for a moment, because the method itself is worth understanding, not just the conclusion it produces. Every time a population shrinks down to a small number of individuals, something specific happens to its genetic diversity. Variation narrows. Certain patterns that would otherwise have been common simply do not survive into the next generation because the people who carried them did not have descendants who lived long enough to pass them on. It is a little like a long chain of whispered messages, except that some of the messages quietly disappear partway through, not because anyone meant to drop them, but because too few people were left to keep repeating them. Across many thousands of years, this creates a recognizable signature inside the genome of every living descendant, a kind of statistical scar tissue. Researchers using newer reconstruction techniques have found exactly this kind of signature embedded in the human genetic record, pointing toward a sustained and severe decline in population size. During the broad window we discussed a moment ago, somewhere in the long stretch between 900,000 and 800,000 years in the past. What makes this particular finding so striking is not simply that a decline happened. Declines happen constantly throughout natural history in every species across every era. What makes this one remarkable is the scale and the duration. The most widely accepted reconstruction suggests that the breeding population, meaning the number of individuals actually contributing offspring to future generations, may have fallen to somewhere in the range of 1,000 to a little over 1,000 individuals sustained at that drastically reduced level for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, possibly well over 100,000 years. That is not a brief famine season. That is closer to 4,000 consecutive generations living inside a genuinely precarious margin generation, after generation, never quite recovering, never quite vanishing either. Scholars still debate the exact mechanisms that could sustain such a prolonged bottleneck without tipping the population into outright extinction. A drop that severe, held in place for that long, sits right at the edge of what a species can typically survive. Some researchers point toward climate volatility severe enough to fragment habitats into small semi-isolated pockets, each one supporting only a handful of bands cut off from one another for long stretches at a time by terrain or distance or simple unfamiliarity with the land beyond their immediate range. Others suggest the answer may lie partly in how adaptable these early populations already were, perhaps better equipped behaviorally to endure scarcity than we tend to assume. The honest answer is that no single explanation fully accounts for how this population survived as long and as narrowly as it apparently did. We are looking at the outline of a crisis without yet having every detail of how it was endured. There is a human dimension to this that I think deserves a quiet moment of its own separate from the statistics. A population sustained at only 1,000 or so breeding individuals for tens of thousands of years means something very specific and very personal, repeated endlessly across uncountable individual lives. It means a young person growing up in a band of perhaps 30 or 40 relatives, watching some of them die young, watching food run short in certain seasons, watching their own group's numbers rise a little and fall a little, year after year, without ever quite breaking free of that narrow ceiling. It means generation after generation of people who never knew anything different, because nothing different had ever existed within living memory. They did not know they were living through a bottleneck. There was no contrast available. To them, no earlier, more abundant era to miss. This was simply what life had always looked like as far as anyone could remember, and that in its own quiet way might be one of the more remarkable parts of the entire story. An entire species teetering near the edge of its own continuation, and yet experiencing that precariousness simply as the unremarkable texture of ordinary days. I find myself thinking about what must have carried them through it season after season, generation after generation, with no way of knowing whether the next year would be the one that finally broke the pattern for good. There must have been knowledge involved, skill certainly, and something harder to name, something closer to sheer persistence repeated by thousands of individual people whose names will never be known to us, whose faces we will never see, but whose continued survival is the entire reason any of us are here to wonder about them tonight. There is one more layer to this part of the story, though, something that researchers have only recently begun to connect to this same narrow window in time, and it touches on a question almost as old as evolutionary science itself. Why during this very same period did certain features of the human skeleton begin shifting in ways that some specialists believe were directly shaped by the pressures of surviving inside such a constrained population? That connection between a near vanishing and the slow reshaping of the human body itself is where we are headed next, and it may be one of the more unexpected threads in this entire story. There is a particular kind of mystery that lives inside the human spine, and tonight I want to bring you into it slowly because it connects directly to the thread we left hanging a moment ago. Somewhere within this same narrow window of crisis, researchers have noticed something curious happening to the human skeleton itself. Something that seems on the surface to have nothing at all to do with population numbers, and yet may be tied to them in a fairly direct way. A particular feature found in many vertebrae today, a fusion event in the lower spine that affects a noticeable percentage of people now living, appears to trace its origins to roughly this same stretch of deep time. It is not a dramatic feature. Most people who have it never notice it, never feel it, never have any reason to think about their own lower back as a kind of fossil record. But its presence, its specific frequency, and its apparent timing all point towards something that emerged during a period of severe genetic narrowing, the kind of narrowing that tends to allow unusual physical traits to spread through a population far more easily than they would in a larger, more genetically varied group. This is worth slowing down on because it touches on something genuinely counterintuitive about how small populations work. In a large, healthy population with wide genetic variety circulating freely between many unrelated groups, an unusual trait, even a fairly neutral one, tends to stay rare. There are simply too many other genetic variations diluting its spread. But inside a small, constrained population, the kind our ancestors were apparently living within for tens of thousands of years, something different happens. Traits that would otherwise have remained uncommon can spread through a much larger share of the group, not necessarily because they offer any particular advantage, but simply because there are so few people contributing to the gene pool that almost any trait carried by enough of them becomes over generations far more common than it ever would have in a larger population. Scholars still debate exactly how directly this specific spinal feature connects to the broader population bottleneck we've been tracing, since correlation across deep time is genuinely difficult to prove with full certainty. But the timing lines up closely enough that many researchers consider it one of the more compelling physical echoes of that ancient narrowing, a kind of quiet fingerprint left not in stone but in the architecture of the human body itself. I find something almost tender in that idea, if I am honest with you. A piece of someone's skeleton 400,000 generations removed from us, still quietly present in the lower backs of people walking around today, completely unaware that they are carrying a small physical memory of a crisis their ancestors lived through and never understood as a crisis at all. It raises a deeper question though, one that takes us somewhere a little more unsettling than skeletons. If a population spends 100,000 years compressed down to only 1,000 or so breeding individuals, what does that actually do to the species as a whole beyond the question of numbers? Population geneticists describe something called genetic drift, a process where in small groups sheer chance plays an outsized role in which traits survive into the next generation and which ones quietly disappear. It has nothing to do with which traits are useful. It has everything to do with which particular individuals happen to have children and which happen not to in a given generation, purely by the ordinary unpredictability of life. Over a few generations, drift barely matters. Over 100,000 years inside a population this constrained, it can reshape an entire species, narrowing its variation, occasionally fixing in place traits that offer no advantage whatsoever, simply because the lottery of survival happened to favour them at a critical, fragile moment. This is part of what makes the bottleneck so significant beyond the simple drama of near extinction. It was not only a brush with disappearing, it was also in its own strange way a sculpting event, one that may have quietly shaped which physical and genetic characteristics carried forward into every human being who exists today. We are not simply descendants of survivors, we are descendants of a very particular, very narrow set of survivors whose individual and largely accidental traits became through sheer scarcity of alternatives the traits of an entire species going forward. There is a more human way to think about this too beyond the science, and it is the part that tends to stay with me longest. Imagine for a moment what it might have meant to be one of perhaps only a few thousand people alive who would ever contribute to humanity's future without any way of knowing it, without any sense of stakes beyond your own immediate family and the season ahead. There is no record of anyone understanding their circumstances in those terms. There is no reason to think they did, and yet here we are, every one of us, the accumulated outcome of choices and chances made by people who believed they were simply living ordinary lives, gathering food, raising children, surviving one difficult year after another. The continuation of an entire species rested for a very long stretch of time on nothing more dramatic than a great many small, unremarkable acts of staying alive. The evidence remains incomplete on precisely how close to outright collapse this population actually came during its hardest stretches. Some reconstructions suggest the numbers may have dipped lower still during particular intervals. Brief stretches within the broader bottleneck where conditions worsened even further before easing again. We are likely looking at a long plateau, punctuated by the sharper dips rather than one smooth unbroken decline, though the precise shape of that curve is still being refined as researchers develop better methods for reading these ancient signals out of modern genomes. What strikes me most turning this over again tonight is how ordinary the whole crisis must have felt from the inside, even as it represented by any outside measure one of the most precarious stretches our species has ever lived through. There is something worth carrying with you into the rest of this story, a kind of quiet reassurance hidden inside all this fragility. The very fact that you are hearing this story at all means the narrowest possible thread held. It did not snap, And the question we have not yet touched, the one waiting just ahead of us, is what eventually allowed that thread to begin widening again, carrying this small struggling population back from the edge towards something resembling abundance once more. You said you're an expert English language scriptwriter for the YouTube channel Life Was Brutal. There is a question worth asking plainly, even gently, before we go further tonight. What does it actually take for a population this small, sustained this long, to begin recovering at all? It's not as simple as conditions improving. 1,000 or so breeding individuals scattered across fragmented pockets of habitat do not simply notice better weather one season and begin multiplying back toward abundance the next. Recovery from a bottleneck this severe is its own slow, fragile process, and it brings with it a layer of the story that tends to surprise people when they first hear it. Population geneticists who study recoveries like this one point to something called the founder effect, a pattern that becomes especially important once a population begins expanding again after a long period of scarcity. Whichever small groups happen to survive longest and happen to be positioned in slightly more favourable terrain when conditions finally begin easing, end up disproportionately represented in everything that follows. It is a little like a handful of surviving threads suddenly being asked to reweave an entire fabric. The pattern that emerges afterward carries the particular characteristics of those specific threads, not some even representative sample of everyone who once existed. Whole lineages, whole variations, whole genetic possibilities that existed earlier in the bottleneck may simply not have made it through to this recovery phase at all. Not because they were inferior in any way, but because the particular bands carrying them were not among the ones still standing when the wider landscape finally began to soften. This is part of what makes the genetic signature so distinctive when researchers examine it today. It is not only narrow, it carries the specific fingerprint of whichever small scattered groups happened to be the ones who made it through to the other side and whose descendants then multiplied outward to eventually become many hundreds of thousands of years later every single human being now alive on this planet. Here is where the evidence remains genuinely incomplete, and where I think honesty matters more than confidence. Researchers can model when this recovery likely began broadly, and can estimate the rough scale of population growth that followed across subsequent tens of thousands of years. What they cannot yet do, not with full certainty, is tell us precisely which environmental shift triggered the turn, or whether the turn was gradual, a slow loosening of pressure across many centuries, or came in smaller pulses, brief windows of relief followed by renewed hardship before conditions finally stabilized. Scholars still debate this sequencing closely because the genomic record, remarkable as it is, behaves more like a long exposure photograph than a single clear snapshot. It shows you the overall shape of change across vast stretches of time far more readily than it shows you the precise rhythm of any particular century within that change. What we do have, and what I find quietly remarkable, is a rough sense of where this recovering population was likely living by the time real expansion took hold. The evidence increasingly points toward parts of eastern and southern Africa as likely centres of this slow-widening regions, where the underlying terrain offered enough variety, enough water, enough seasonal reliability to support gradually larger and more interconnected groups than the fragmented bands of the bottleneck era ever could. It is worth picturing this for a moment not as a single triumphant turning point, but as something closer to a long exhale. Bands that had spent generations isolated from one another, surviving in relative solitude, slowly beginning to encounter each other again. New connections forming where there had been silence. New genetic mixing where there had been narrow repeated circulation within tiny related groups. That mixing matters more than it might first appear. One of the quieter dangers of any long bottleneck is not simply the risk of starvation or predation, real as those were, but something slower and less visible. a kind of genetic stagnation that comes from too many generations of close relatives having children together within an isolated group. Reduced genetic variety can weaken a population's resilience against disease, against environmental shock, against the ordinary unpredictability of survival. When isolated bands finally began reconnecting, exchanging people, exchanging knowledge, exchanging the unconscious genetic variety that comes with any wider mixing of unrelated families, it likely did more than simply grow the population in raw numbers. It very possibly restored a kind of biological resilience that the species had been slowly losing throughout the worst of the narrowing. There is something almost moving in imagining that moment multiplied across thousands of unremembered encounters. A small band moving along a river they had not followed in a generation, encountering unfamiliar faces near a waterhole they assumed belonged to no one else. Caution probably at first. Then recognition of shared circumstance, shared hardship, shared humanity. However dimly that recognition might have registered to people without our vocabulary for any of it. Out of encounters like that, repeated quietly across an unknown number of years, came the genetic mixing that allowed the recovery to take hold and sustain itself. It would be a mistake, though, to imagine this recovery as smooth, steady, or guaranteed. The evidence suggests something closer to fits and starts a population edging upward, encountering new strain, perhaps losing ground again briefly before resuming its slow climb. There is no reason to think the individuals living through any single generation of this recovery would have felt secure at it. They had no way of comparing their numbers to the deep past or the unknown future. They simply lived inside whatever conditions surrounded them the way every generation does, without the comfort of knowing whether the gradual easing they were experiencing would hold, or whether it was only a pause before conditions tightened again. It did hold eventually, though not quickly and not without further surprises along the way. There is a particular shift waiting for us just ahead in this story, one that takes us out of the realm of slow demographic recovery and into something far more specific, a moment where the physical evidence itself, not only the genetic record, begins to offer us a glimpse of what these recovering populations were actually doing with their lives, and where exactly on the African landscape some of the clearest fingerprints of this entire story still remain waiting in the ground for anyone patient enough to look. There is a place worth visiting now, not in person but in imagination, because the ground itself has things to say about this story that the genome alone cannot tell us. Across certain regions of southern and eastern Africa, archaeologists have spent decades carefully excavating sites that fall within or just after the broad recovery window we have been tracing. These are not dramatic locations in the way a ruined temple or a battlefield might be. Dramatic. They are often quiet places, now rock shelters, cave mouths, ancient lake shores long since dried into something else entirely. But layered into their sediment, sometimes meters deep, are the accumulated traces of people living, working and surviving across thousands of years, pressed down into the earth like pages in a very slow book. One detail tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, and I think it deserves a moment of its own here. At certain sites in southern Africa, archaeologists have found evidence of deliberate, sophisticated heat treatment of stone, a process where early populations apparently learned to bake certain types of rock in low-controlled heat before shaping it, because the heating made the stone easier to flake into finer, sharper tools. This is not a simple trick. It requires understanding fire well enough to use it as a tool in itself, not merely for warmth or cooking, but as a deliberate step in a multi-stage manufacturing process. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread this technique was during the earliest periods of its use, and exactly which populations developed it independently versus inheriting it from shared ancestors. But its presence tells us something important about the people we've been following through this story. Whatever hardship had narrowed their numbers down to a precarious thread, it had not narrowed their ingenuity. There is something worth sitting with in that. We have spent considerable time tonight on numbers, on bottlenecks, on the cold mathematics of genetic drift and founder populations. It would be easy to come away imagining these people as passive, simply enduring whatever the environment handed them, surviving by luck alone. The archaeological record pushes back against that image rather firmly. These were people actively solving problems, refining techniques, passing specialized knowledge to their children with enough fidelity that we can still recognize the pattern in stone tools recovered tens of thousands of years apart. Survival in this story was never only a matter of waiting for conditions to improve. It involved a great deal of quiet accumulated cleverness, repeated and refined across countless generations who will never be known to us by name. Some of these same regions have also yielded something else, a detail that touches on a part of human life we rarely think to associate with this deep period at all. Traces of pigment-used ground mineral material that shows signs of having been deliberately processed, possibly for symbolic or decorative purposes, have turned up at sites whose dating places them within striking distance of the population recovery we discussed a moment ago. The evidence remains incomplete regarding precisely what these pigments were used for. We cannot know whether they marked the body-decorated tools' signified status within a group or served some entirely different purpose lost to us now. But their presence raises a quiet, almost startling question. Were these recovering populations not only rebuilding their numbers, but also rebuilding or perhaps developing for the first time some early thread of symbolic thought, some impulse toward meaning beyond pure survival? It's worth asking gently without rushing to an answer what that might suggest about the relationship between hardship and creativity. Did the pressure of having so narrowly avoided disappearance somehow sharpen these populations toward new forms of expression, toward marking themselves and their surroundings in ways earlier, more abundant populations may never have needed to? Or is this simply coincidence, two unrelated threads of human development happening to fall within the same broad window of deep time? I do not think anyone currently studying this period would claim certainty either way, but it is the kind of question that lingers pleasantly, the kind worth carrying quietly with you, rather than needing resolve tonight. What the physical record gives us taken altogether is a population that was doing far more than simply not dying. They were refining tools through techniques that required real chemical and thermal understanding. They were possibly engaging with colour and symbol in ways that hint at inner lives every bit as rich in their own context as our own. They were teaching, learning, adjusting, experimenting generation after generation, scattered across a landscape that had nearly erased them entirely only tens of thousands of years before. There is a particular irony worth noticing here, one that I find myself returning to. The very narrowness of this population, the thing that nearly ended the human story altogether, may have also been the crucible that pushed certain technologies and behaviours to refine themselves more quickly than they otherwise might have. Small, tightly connected groups dependent entirely on shared knowledge for survival often transmit skill with remarkable fidelity because there is no room for waste, no margin for techniques to be forgotten or abandoned. Difficult as it surely was to live through this period, may have quietly sharpened the very tools, both literal and cultural, that would eventually allow human populations to expand well beyond anything the bottleneck generations could have imagined. We have spent this part of the evening down in the ground among stone tools and pigment traces, among the quiet, accumulated cleverness of people who left behind no names, but left behind unmistakably evidence of minds at work. There is a wider question waiting just past this, though one that pulls us back up out of the sediment and toward the genome once more, toward the strange, almost unsettling fact that some researchers now suspect more than one population narrowing may have occurred across human prehistory, and toward what that might mean for how we understand our own beginnings. Let us widen the frame a little, because the bottleneck we have spent so much of tonight inside is not, as it turns out, the only one in our family's deep past. For years, the story most people had heard about humanity nearly disappearing centered on a different event entirely, one that took place far more recently and involved a far more dramatic cause. Roughly 74,000 years ago, a volcano named Toba on the island, now known as Sumatra, erupted with a force almost impossible to picture properly. It remains one of the largest volcanic events of the last 2 million years, throwing ash and sulfur high enough into the atmosphere to circle the globe, dimming sunlight and likely cooling the climate for years afterward. For a long stretch of scientific history, many researchers believed this single catastrophic event was responsible for crushing the human population down to a tiny surviving remnant, an idea sometimes called the Toba catastrophe theory. It is a genuinely compelling story, and I understand its appeal completely. A single identifiable disaster, a clear cause and effect, a villain, in the form of a mountain that briefly darkened the sky. But here is where honesty matters more than drama, because the picture has grown considerably more complicated since that theory first gained popularity. Newer genetic research, including the very bottleneck we have spent this evening exploring, points toward a population narrowing that occurred hundreds of thousands of years before Toba ever erupted, which means the eruption cannot be the original cause of the crisis we have been tracing tonight. Scholars still debate how much additional pressure Toba placed on human and other populations that were already living in the world by the time it erupted. And some researchers maintain that local effects in certain regions, particularly parts of southern Africa and South Asia, may have been more severe than once assumed. But the idea that one volcanic eruption alone explains humanity's brush with disappearance no longer holds up as the complete answer it once seemed to be. This matters for reasons beyond simple correction. It tells us something important about how scientific understanding of deep history actually develops, which is rarely in one clean dramatic revelation, and far more often through a slow layering of evidence that gradually refines and sometimes overturns earlier explanations. The genetic bottleneck we explored earlier tonight, the one stretching across that vast window centered roughly 900,000 years in the past, was identified using techniques that simply did not exist when the Toba theory first took hold. As the tools for reading ancient population history out of modern genomes have grown more refined, researchers have begun to suspect that human prehistory may contain not one single brush with disappearance, but possibly several separated by enormous stretches of time, each leaving its own particular signature inside the genome, layered atop one another like sediment. That is a genuinely strange thing to consider if you let it settle for a moment. We've been speaking all evening as though there were a single defining crisis in our deep ancestry, one narrow doorway through which the entire future of the species had to pass. The truth may be considerably more layered than that, a species that brushed against its own ending, more than once, across vastly different eras, for entirely different reasons, each time surviving each crisis through whatever combination of luck, adaptability, and quiet persistence happened to be available in that particular stretch of deep time. What does it mean then that we may be descendants not of one narrow escape, but of several? There is something worth turning over slowly here without needing to land on a tidy conclusion. It suggests perhaps that vulnerability of this kind was not some single unlucky accident in our family's past, but something closer to a recurring feature of what it has always meant to be a small, slow-breeding, environmentally exposed species moving through a planet whose climate has never been particularly stable for long. Every population alive today, human or otherwise, carries some version of this history written into the patterns of its own genetic diversity. We simply happen to be a species capable of reading our own version of that history back out of ourselves, which is either a remarkable scientific achievement or a strange kind of self-portrait depending on how you choose to look at it. There is a particular site worth mentioning here because it captures this layered uncertainty rather beautifully. Researchers working in parts of South Asia have found evidence that some human and other hominin populations may have continued living in certain sheltered regions even through the immediate aftermath of the Toba eruption, surviving conditions that by older models should have made survival there essentially impossible. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how these populations managed it, whether through fortunate local geography, access to resources unaffected by the broader climate disruption, or simply resilience that earlier theories had significantly underestimated. What this tells us gently but firmly is that our ancestors were rarely as fragile as the simplest version of any single catastrophe story tends to suggest. They were stubborn, adaptable, frequently surviving in conditions that on paper look nearly impossible. I think there is something quietly reassuring in untangling the science this carefully, even though it complicates the simpler story. A single dramatic villain, one eruption on bad season is in some ways easier to imagine than a long-layered history of repeated narrow escapes scattered unevenly across hundreds of thousands of years. But the more complicated version is also, I think, the more honest tribute to what our ancestors actually accomplished. Not surviving one terrible event through sheer luck, but surviving an entire deep history of recurring precariousness again and again until the threads finally widened enough to become the 8 billion lives now spread across this planet. There is still a question we have not properly addressed tonight, one that brings us back at last to where all of this evidence eventually has to lead. What did the people living through this story actually look like physically by the time real recovery had taken hold? And how much of what made them recognizably human in the way we would understand that word today had already begun to take shape during the very crisis that nearly erased them? Picture for a moment a face that would have seemed almost but not quite familiar to us. By the time the recovery we have been tracing tonight had taken firm hold, the population descending from those narrow, bottleneck generations was beginning to carry physical features that researchers studying ancient skeletal remains describe as transitional. Neither fully like the more robust hominins of earlier periods, nor entirely like ourselves. Brow ridges somewhat less pronounced than in earlier ancestors, but still present. A skull shape gradually rounding in certain places, gradually flattening in others, the long, slow architecture of a species in the middle of becoming something it had not quite been before, and had not yet fully finished becoming. If you had stood in front of one of these individuals, I suspect you would have felt an odd layered recognition. Something would have struck you as unmistakably human, in the eyes, in the posture, in the obvious intelligence behind whatever they were doing with their hands. And something else would have struck you as subtly, persistently different in ways harder to articulate than to simply feel. This in-between quality is not a flaw in the fossil record. It is in many ways the entire point of it. Evolution rarely produces a clean line where one form of human ends and another begins. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how to classify several skeletal remains from sites within this broad window, partly because the individuals themselves were living through a genuinely transitional period, carrying combinations of features that do not map neatly onto the categories scientists use to organize hominin history. Some specialists place certain remains from this era within a proposed grouping sometimes referred to by the working name Homo bodoensis, a name introduced only fairly recently meant to help organize a confusing scatter of remains from Africa during this general period that previously did not fit comfortably into existing categories. Scholars still debate whether this classification will hold up as more remains are discovered and analysed, and that debate itself is worth appreciating rather than finding frustrating. It reflects scientists doing exactly what good scientists should do, adjusting their frameworks as new evidence requires it rather than forcing ambiguous remains into categories established before this period was well understood at all. There is something quietly moving in recognizing that the individuals living through this recovery would not have known they were transitional anything. They were not waiting to become more like us. They were simply living as fully and completely human in every way that mattered to them as anyone has ever lived in any era. The categories we use to describe them are entirely our invention, built centuries later by people trying to make sense of bones and stones left behind by lives that at the time they were lived needed no such categorization at all. What strikes me most about this period turning it over again tonight is how much of what we consider essentially human, the capacity for symbolic thought, for sophisticated tool-making, for transmitting complex knowledge across generations with real fidelity, appears to have been either present or actively emerging during the very same window when the population itself remained so narrow and so vulnerable. There is a real question worth asking here, one without an easy answer. Did the pressure of nearly disappearing somehow accelerate the development of these distinctly human capacities, forcing cognitive and cultural innovation as a kind of necessary response to scarcity? Or were these capacities already developing along their own separate timelines, simply continuing forward regardless of population size present in the species, whether the numbers were narrow or abundant? Researchers studying cognitive evolution remain genuinely divided on this question, and I do not think there is a tidy resolution waiting to be discovered anytime soon. It may be that both forces were operating simultaneously, each reinforcing the other in ways too tangled now to fully separate. There is a detail from this period that tends to surprise people, something easy to overlook amid all this discussion of skulls and classification. At certain sites, archaeologists have recovered evidence suggesting these populations were already engaging in something resembling long-distance resource transport, carrying particular types of stone many tens of kilometers from their original source to the place where they were eventually shaped and used. This might sound unremarkable at first, but consider what it actually implies. It suggests these populations were not simply living wherever resources happened to be locally available. They were planning ahead, carrying material with them across real distances, anticipating future needs, rather than only responding to immediate ones. That is a meaningfully different kind of cognition than simple moment-to-moment survival. It implies memory, intention, and something close to what we might recognize as foresight. Foresight is in its own quiet way one of the more remarkable threads running through this entire story. A population narrow enough to nearly vanish, carrying stone across long distances for tools they had not yet made for needs they had not yet encountered. Planning for a future they had every reason statistically to doubt they would actually see. There is something almost defiant in that, though I doubt anyone living through it would have described it in such terms. They were simply doing what seemed sensible the way people have always done what seemed sensible, one practical decision at a time, rarely pausing to consider the larger pattern their accumulated decisions were quietly forming. We are nearing the point in this story where the long narrow thread we have been following finally begins to widen in earnest, where scattered, recovering bands start becoming something larger, something closer to the more familiar patterns of expansion that would eventually carry human populations out of Africa entirely and into nearly every corner of the world. Before we follow them out that far, though, there is one more quiet, unresolved question worth sitting with. Question about exactly how many separate strands of early humanity were moving through this landscape at the same time, and what may have happened when some of those strands, after so long apart, finally crossed paths again. They were, it turns out, never quite as alone as the bottleneck story might make them sound. For most of this evening we have been speaking as though there were a single thread of population moving through this crisis, narrowing, holding, slowly widening again. That is the clearest way to tell the story, and broadly speaking it remains accurate for the specific ancestral line we have been following. But the African continent during this same general era was not occupied by only one human population living in isolation from all others. Other related groups, distinct branches of the wider human family tree, were almost certainly moving through other regions during overlapping stretches of this same deep timeline. Some closely related to the population we have centered tonight's story around, others more distant, the products of much earlier divergences, stretching back further still. This matters enormously for understanding what eventually happened as the recovery we discussed earlier gathered momentum. Population recovery is rarely a story of one isolated group simply multiplying in a vacuum. It is far more often a story of separate groups having drifted apart through long stretches of isolation, gradually re-encountering one another as expanding ranges begin to overlap again. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how many distinct populations were moving through Africa during this recovery period, and scholars still debate how much genetic exchange occurred between them. But the genome itself preserves traces of more than one ancestral contribution layered together in ways that suggest mixing rather than a single clean, unbroken line of descent. There is a particular finding from recent genetic research that tends to startle people the first time they encounter it, and I want to walk through it carefully because it complicates the tidy version of this story in a genuinely interesting way. Some researchers studying deep African population history have proposed that modern human ancestry may trace back not to one single ancestral population, but to at least two distinct long-separated groups that diverged from each other. Hundreds of thousands of years ago, lived apart for an extended period and then came back into contact and interbred well before the more familiar expansions out of Africa eventually began. If this reconstruction holds up under continued scrutiny, and the evidence here is still actively being refined, it would mean that the human genome carries within it not the simple signature of one population's narrow survival, but the layered signature of multiple populations, each with their own separate history of isolation and hardship, eventually merging into the ancestry shared by every person alive today. I find this version of the story complicated, as it is considerably more moving than the simpler one. It would mean that what eventually became us was not the product of one thread surviving alone against impossible odds, but several threads separated by distance and time, each enduring their own version of scarcity and uncertainty, each developing along slightly different paths before finding their way back to one another, and combining into something neither population could have produced on its own. There is something quietly beautiful in imagining that kind of reunion, two or more groups of distant relatives unaware of each other's existence for tens of thousands of years, eventually crossing paths again, somewhere on the African landscape, and choosing in whatever way such choices were made at the time to join rather than remain separate. What would such an encounter have actually looked like? We cannot know with any real specificity, and I want to be honest about that rather than inventing detail the evidence cannot support. There is no surviving account, no oral tradition stretching back far enough to capture it. Nothing beyond the statistical traces left behind in our shared deoxyribonucleic acid. But it is worth sitting just for a moment with the basic shape of the possibility. Groups who had developed slightly different tool traditions, slightly different ways of moving through landscapes slightly different, accumulated knowledge about which plants could be eaten and which avoided encountering one another after generations of separation, and somehow gradually building enough trust and familiarity to begin sharing resources, territory, and eventually children. This layered ancestry may also help explain something that has puzzled researchers studying the broader pattern of human genetic diversity across Africa today, which remains even now considerably more varied than the diversity found in populations elsewhere in the world. Mainstream genetics points toward this depth and variety as itself a kind of inherited memory, a faint reflection of a deeper, more complicated ancestral history than the single bottleneck narrative alone could fully account for. Populations across the African continent today carry distinct genetic signatures that likely trace back at least in part to these older, separate strands of ancestry. Strands that diverged long before the narrow bottleneck we explored earlier in this story, and that came back together at some point during or after the recovery that followed it. There is an honest tension worth naming directly here, because Life Was Brutal has always tried to hold space for genuine scholarly uncertainty rather than smoothing it away for the sake of a cleaner story. Not every researcher studying this period agrees on the precise number of ancestral populations involved, nor on exactly when and how thoroughly they mixed. Some reconstructions suggest the divergence and remixing happened more gradually and continuously than a simple two-population model implies, with smaller semi-isolated groups splitting and rejoining repeatedly across enormous stretches of time, rather than two cleanly separate lineages meeting at one identifiable point. The honest picture as it currently stands is less a single dramatic reunion, and more a long, slow, repeated weaving and unweaving of relatively small populations across an enormous African landscape over an almost unimaginable span of time. What remains constant through every version of this reconstruction, though, is the basic shape of the story we have spent this entire evening following. A population, or perhaps several related populations, brushing dangerously close to disappearing entirely, surviving through some combination of luck, adaptability, and accumulated human ingenuity, and eventually finding their way back toward abundance, carrying forward a genetic inheritance shaped as much by absence as by presence, by the threads that did not survive as much as by the ones that did. There is a further question waiting just past this one, and it is perhaps the most consequential question in this entire story, because it asks what eventually happened once this slowly recovering, increasingly interconnected population had grown large enough and confident enough to begin doing something none of their ancestors during the narrowest years of the bottleneck could ever have managed. Leaving. Leaving, as it turns out, was not one event. It was many scattered across thousands of years by different groups for different reasons with different outcomes, and most of them we now know did not succeed in any lasting sense. This is one of the more humbling corrections that genetic and archaeological research has brought to the old tidy version of human dispersal many of us absorbed. Growing up the image of a single confident wave of people walking purposefully out of Africa and spreading steadily across the world. The evidence increasingly tells a messier, more human story. Multiple groups at multiple points across a long stretch of time appear to have pushed beyond the African continent into the Near East, and beyond following game, following coastlines, following whatever combination of curiosity and necessity moves any population toward unfamiliar ground. Several of these early movements, the evidence suggests, simply did not last. Small founding groups cut off from the larger population they had left behind, facing unfamiliar climates and unfamiliar competition, appear to have died out without leaving any detectable trace in the ancestry of people living today. Scholars still debate exactly how many separate dispersal attempts occurred before one finally took root successfully, but the number is very likely more than one and possibly several. There is something worth pausing on here, something that connects directly back to everything we have spent this evening exploring. The population we have been following through this entire story, the one that survived its own near disappearance, the one that slowly recovered, mixed and grew, was not guaranteed success, simply because it had already endured so much. Each small group that ventured beyond familiar territory was in its own way repeating a smaller version of the same fragile gamble their distant ancestors had survived during the bottleneck itself. A handful of people dependent entirely on each other, moving into conditions they did not fully understand, with no guarantee that their particular thread would be the one that continued forward. Most threads of this kind across the long span of human prehistory simply ended. We only know about the rare ones that did not because we are descended from them, and survivorship has a way of making outcomes look more inevitable in hindsight than they ever actually were at the time. The detail that tends to surprise people most when this part of the story comes up involves a particular site in the Levant, the broader region connecting Africa to the rest of Eurasia. Remains discovered at certain locations there have been dated to roughly 180,000 years ago, considerably earlier than the major lasting dispersal that most genetic models point toward, and considerably earlier than many textbooks, even fairly recent ones, suggest humans first ventured beyond Africa in any capacity. These remains appear to represent exactly the kind of early, ultimately unsuccessful dispersal we have just been discussing. A population that pushed outward, persisted for some span of time, and then, as far as the genetic record can tell us, left no lasting descendants among populations living outside Africa today. The evidence remains incomplete regarding precisely why this particular group did not establish a lasting foothold, while later groups eventually did. Climate shifts affecting the region, competition with other hominin populations already established their simple demographic bad luck repeated across too many consecutive difficult years. Any or all of these may have played a role. What finally did succeed sometime within a window that most current genetic reconstructions place somewhere between 70 and 60,000 years ago? Though researchers continue refining this estimate as new evidence accumulates, appears to have been a considerably smaller founding event than people often imagine. Genetic diversity among populations descended from this successful dispersal is consistently lower than the diversity found among populations who remained within Africa, a pattern that strongly suggests the group or groups who successfully established lasting populations outside the continent were themselves relatively small. Another quiet echo of the same bottleneck principle we explored earlier in this story repeating itself on a smaller, more localized scale. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it deserves more weight than a passing mention. Every person whose ancestry traces outside Africa, which includes the overwhelming majority of people listening to this story tonight, descends from a founding population that may have numbered, by some estimates, only in the low thousands, possibly fewer. This is not the bottleneck we spent the earlier hours of this evening discussing. It is a separate, smaller narrowing layered on top of the first, affecting only the specific branch of humanity that eventually spread into Europe-Asia and ultimately every other inhabited continent. The fragility we have been tracing all evening was not a single event in humanity's deep past. It appears again and again at different scales, affecting different branches of the same extended family, each time leaving its own particular fingerprint behind in the genetic inheritance of everyone descended from it. There is a rhetorical question worth asking here gently, because I think it captures something genuinely strange about how we tend to think about our own history. Why does it feel more natural to imagine human expansion as a single, confident, ever-widening story of success, when the evidence so consistently points towards something closer to repeated, narrow, uncertain gambles, most of which failed with only a small number eventually paying off across almost unimaginable stretches of time? I suspect it has something to do with how survivorship shapes memory. We are every one of us the descendants of the gambles that worked. It is easy to forget how many did not simply because no one remains to tell us about them directly. The only reason we know about them at all is through careful archaeological and genetic detective work piecing together traces of populations who by any reasonable measure vanished completely from the human story except for the faint, indirect evidence they left behind in the ground. Once this particular successful dispersal had taken hold, though something changed in the pattern of human expansion that had not been true of earlier failed attempts. The descendants of this group appear to have spread with unusual speed and persistence, reaching parts of South Asia and Australia by roughly 65,000 years ago, according to several current archaeological and genetic estimates, reaching parts of Europe by somewhat later, and eventually across many further thousands of years reaching the Americas as well. This is not to say the journey was smooth or without its own further losses along the way. Smaller branches of this expanding population almost certainly continued to fail in various regions, just as earlier dispersal attempts had. But the core thread this time held widening steadily enough across enough generations that it eventually became the ancestry shared by the overwhelming majority of humanity living today. There is something worth noticing in how this successful expansion intersected with populations already established outside Africa. By this point, populations descended from much earlier human relatives who had left Africa long before populations we now know by names that have become reasonably familiar, even outside academic circles, including the group most commonly referred to as Neanderthals, along with other less widely known relatives identified through fragmentary remains and genetic traces found in specific regions of Asia. When the expanding population we have been following encountered these older, already established relatives, the genetic record makes clear that the encounters were not always hostile, and were sometimes in a biological sense remarkably intimate. Interbreeding occurred, leaving traces that persist in the genomes of many people living today, particularly outside Africa, where small but measurable percentages of ancestry can be traced back to these older populations who had themselves been living outside Africa for hundreds of thousands of years by the time these newer arrivals appeared. The most widely accepted reconstruction holds that these interactions were complicated, varying considerably by region and by time period, sometimes involving genuine coexistence and exchange, sometimes involving competition for the same limited resources, climates, and territories. We do not have, and likely never will have, a complete account of exactly how these relationships unfolded on a day-to-day basis. What we do have written quietly into the genomes of billions of people alive today is clear evidence that these encounters happened repeatedly across multiple regions, leaving behind a kind of inherited memory of contact between populations that had been separated from each other for staggering lengths of time, only to find themselves briefly sharing the same landscape again. There is something quietly remarkable in recognizing that the story we have spent this entire evening following, a population narrowing nearly to extinction, slowly recovering, mixing with separated relatives, eventually spreading outward in repeated, mostly failed attempts before one finally succeeded, does not end with that success. It continues, layering further encounters, further mixing, further narrow gambles across every continent these expanding populations eventually reached. The fragility never fully disappears from this story. It simply changes shape again and again as the population itself changes shape, spreading further from its origins, while still carrying deep within its genetic inheritance the accumulated traces of everything it survived to get there. We have followed this thread a long way now, from a narrow population scattered across an ancient African landscape, through recovery, through reunion with distant relatives, through repeated, mostly unsuccessful attempts to expand beyond the continent that had sheltered this story for so long. There is one further dimension to this story we have not yet touched directly, though, one that brings us back in a sense to where this entire evening began. What does all of this evidence actually mean for how we should understand human resilience itself? And what does it suggest about how close precisely the entire arc of human history that followed actually came to never happening at all? There is a number worth holding quietly in your mind for a moment, because it tends to recalibrate how a person thinks about their own existence once they actually sit with it. Population biologists have a concept called effective population size, a way of measuring not simply how many individuals existed at a given moment, but how many were actually contributing genetically to future generations across sustained periods of time. When researchers calculate the effective population size of humanity's ancestors during the deepest part of the bottleneck we explored earlier, this evening the numbers that come back are smaller than most people, even fairly well-read people, tend to expect. Estimates for certain stretches of this narrowing fall to roughly 1,200 to a little over 1,300 breeding individuals sustained at that level. For a span some researchers calculate at well beyond 100,000 years. For comparison, that is a smaller sustained population than many endangered species conservationists monitor with active concern today. We are in a very real and scientifically measurable sense descended from a population that would qualify by modern conservation standards as critically endangered for a length of time longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization several times over. I do not share that comparison to be alarming, the opposite really. I share it because I think it deserves to be felt, rather than simply understood as an abstract figure. Every war you have ever read about, every empire that rose and fell, every migration, every invention, every quiet, ordinary life lived anywhere on this planet across the last several thousand years of recorded history, all of it depends entirely on a thread that passed through a population smaller than the number of seats in many concert halls held there, for longer than agriculture has existed and somehow did not break. The evidence remains incomplete regarding precisely why it did not break, and I think that honest uncertainty is itself worth dwelling on rather than rushing past. Population biology generally predicts that groups sustained at such low numbers for such extended periods face substantially elevated risk of extinction through accumulated genetic problems, through vulnerability to disease, through simple demographic bad luck compounding across generations. Many small isolated populations throughout natural history faced with comparable circumstances have not survived them. Our ancestors did. Scholars still debate which specific combination of factors made the difference, whether it was behavioral flexibility, some advantage in diet or shelter-seeking beneficial genetic variation that happened to be present despite the overall narrowness, or simply a long, fortunate repeated string of seasons that could easily have gone differently. There is no fully satisfying answer yet. There may never be one. Sometimes the honest scientific conclusion is closer to acknowledging how narrow the margin actually was than to explaining away that narrowness with false certainty. There is a particular kind of perspective that opens up once you sit with this for a while, and I want to offer it to you gently because I think it is one of the more genuinely comforting realizations available in deep history, despite how it might initially sound. If our ancestors endured 100,000 years at the very edge of disappearing season after season, generation after generation, without any of them ever knowing whether their particular group would be among the ones that continued forward, then a great deal of what feels overwhelming in any single human life, any single difficult year, any single season of hardship sits within a lineage that has already proven repeatedly almost unimaginably durable, not invulnerable. The bottleneck makes painfully clear that survival was never guaranteed, but durable in a way that very few other species faced with comparable circumstances have managed to demonstrate. This durability shows up in places beyond the purely genetic record too, and there is a detail worth mentioning here that connects to something contemporary research has only recently begun to appreciate properly. Several populations of large mammals that lived through comparable climate instability during this same general period, including certain ancient elephant relatives and several large carnivore species whose fossil remains have been studied closely, appear to have gone extinct during stretches when human ancestors facing broadly similar environmental pressures did not. This does not mean human ancestors were simply superior in some straightforward sense. It means they were for reasons still not entirely understood, equipped with some combination of behavioral flexibility, dietary breadth, or social cooperation that allowed them to weather conditions severe enough to eliminate other large-bodied species sharing the same general landscape and facing many of the same pressures. Social cooperation in particular deserves a slower look here, because it may be one of the more underappreciated threads running through this entire story. A population this small, this exposed, would have depended enormously on the strength of relationships within and even between small bands on shared knowledge, shared food during lean periods, shared care for children and the injured and the old. There is no fossilized record of kindness, no artifact that directly proves cooperation in the way a stone tool proves toolmaking. But the mathematics of survival at this scale make a strong indirect case for it. Populations this small facing conditions this difficult sustained across, stretches this long are exceptionally unlikely to persist through pure individual self-interest alone. Something closer to sustained mutual reliance generation after generation almost certainly played a quiet, essential, largely invisible role in keeping this thread from finally breaking. It's worth imagining just for a moment what that mutual reliance might have actually looked like in practice, not as abstract cooperation, but as specific, repeated, unremarkable acts. Someone sharing food they could have kept entirely for themselves. Someone caring for a child who was not their own, after that child's parents did not survive a difficult season. Someone slower or older or temporarily injured being supported by the group, rather than abandoned to fend for themselves because the group itself depended on every available pair of hands and every available piece of accumulated knowledge and could not easily absorb the loss of either. None of this is provable in the specific. All of it is strongly suggested by the simple, persistent fact that the population survived at all across a span of time long enough that pure chance alone seems an insufficient explanation on its own. There is a thought I want to leave with you as we approach the latter part of this evening's story, one that I find myself returning to often when I think about this particular chapter of deep human history. We tend to measure resilience in our own era against dramatic individual events, a single terrible year, a single crisis survived and overcome. The resilience our ancestors demonstrated during this bottleneck was nothing like that. It was slow, repetitive, largely invisible to the people living through it, who had no way of comparing their circumstances to any earlier, easier era, and therefore likely experienced their own precariousness simply as the unremarkable texture of ordinary life, the way we discussed earlier this evening. There is a particular kind of courage in that, though I am not sure courage is quite the right word for something no one understood themselves to be doing. Perhaps endurance is closer. 100,000 years of endurance, repeated by thousands of individual people across countless individual lives, none of whom ever knew the outcome of what they were collectively sustaining. We are approaching now the part of this story where the full weight of everything we have traced this evening begins to settle into its proper place, where the threads of genetics, archaeology, climate, and sheer human persistence finally draw together into something resembling a complete picture. Before we arrive there, though, there remains one further question worth sitting with. Quietly, a question about what exactly modern science still cannot explain about this story, and why some of the deepest uncertainty in this entire account may turn out to be the most honest and the most important part of it. Science, for all its careful methods and accumulating evidence, has a particular kind of honesty it owes to a story like this one, and I think this late in the evening is exactly the right moment to sit with it directly. The method we've leaned on most heavily throughout tonight, reading population history, out of the genetic patterns carried by people living today, is genuinely remarkable, but it is not without real limitations, and a careful telling of this story should not pretend otherwise. The particular genetic reconstruction technique most closely associated with identifying the deep bottleneck we explored earlier. This evening, often referred to by researchers using the shorthand name fast infinitesimal time coalescent process, depends on complex statistical modeling applied to patterns of genetic variation found across many thousands of individual genomes. It is an extraordinary tool. It is also like every scientific method built on certain assumptions about how populations behave, how mutations accumulate, and how migration and mixing complicate the underlying signal. Several research groups working independently of the original study have since applied related but distinct methods to similar genetic data and arrived at findings that, while broadly supportive of a significant ancient population narrowing, differ somewhat in their estimates of timing, severity, and duration. Scholars still debate these specifics actively, and that debate is ongoing in published research as recently as the past few years, not settled in some distant academic past. I want to be careful here, because I think there is an important difference between healthy scientific debate and genuine doubt about whether something happened at all. The broad shape of this story, a severe and sustained narrowing of the human ancestral population sometime within the deep Pleistocene, is not seriously disputed across the major research groups studying this period. What remains genuinely contested are the finer details. Exactly how low the population fell, exactly how long the narrowing lasted, exactly which environmental or climatic factors triggered it most directly, exactly how this particular bottleneck relates to other proposed narrowings identified by other research teams using other genetic markers and other statistical approaches. The picture, in other words, is real, but it is also still being actively drawn, refined, and in places redrawn by working scientists who do not yet fully agree among themselves on every detail. There is something worth appreciating in that ongoing disagreement rather than finding it disappointing. A field where every researcher agreed on every detail of an event this deep in time, this difficult to study directly, would actually be a field worth being somewhat suspicious of. The genuine, sometimes pointed disagreement visible in the published research surrounding this bottleneck is a sign of a healthy scientific process working exactly as it should. Multiple independent teams testing each other's methods, questioning each other's assumptions, refining the picture collectively in a way that no single research group working alone could ever achieve on its own. One particular point of ongoing contention deserves mention here, because it touches on something that complicates the story in an honestly interesting way. Some researchers have raised the possibility that certain patterns identified as evidence of a population bottleneck could at least theoretically also be produced by other demographic processes entirely, such as a long period of unusually limited migration between otherwise stable regional populations, rather than an actual collapse in overall numbers. This is sometimes called a structured population model, and the evidence remains incomplete regarding how confidently researchers can distinguish between these different possible explanations, using only the genetic signal currently available. Most researchers working in this area still consider an actual population decline the more likely explanation given the overall weight of the evidence. But the alternative possibility has not been entirely ruled out, and a careful telling of this story owes you that honesty rather than presenting a single interpretation as though it were beyond any possible challenge. What I find genuinely moving about sitting with this level of uncertainty rather than glossing past it is what it reveals about the actual practice of historical science, as opposed to the tidy, settled version that often gets presented in simplified retellings. The researchers working on this question are not simply uncovering a story that already exists, fully formed, waiting to be read. They are constructing it carefully through repeated testing, through disagreement, through the slow accumulation of independent evidence from different methods that either reinforce or complicate one another. The story we have spent this entire evening following is, in a very real sense, still being written not in the deep past where the events themselves occurred, but in laboratories and universities around the world today by people who will likely revise parts of what we have discussed tonight as new techniques and new genetic data become available in years ahead. There is a particular kind of comfort available in that, even though it might initially seem to undercut the certainty of everything we have explored this evening, if the picture of our deepest origin remains somewhat unfinished subject to ongoing refinement, then there is still discovery waiting ahead, still more to learn about where we came from and how narrowly we managed to continue existing at all. The story does not end simply because tonight's telling of it must eventually end. It continues quietly in the ongoing work of people studying ancient genomes, examining newly excavated remains, and slowly, carefully refining a picture that may never be entirely complete, but grows steadily more detailed and more trustworthy with each passing year. I think it is worth returning gently to the deeper question beneath all of this scientific nuance, the question that has quietly run beneath every part of tonight's story. Why does any of this matter beyond simple curiosity about deep, abstract population numbers from hundreds of thousands of years ago? I think it matters because of what it tells us, however incompletely, about the relationship between fragility and continuity, about how something can come astonishingly close to ending and still somehow continue. Every living person carries somewhere within their own genetic inheritance the accumulated outcome of choices, chances, and quiet endurance stretching back across an almost incomprehensible span of time. We rarely think about this directly in the ordinary course of our days. There is no particular reason we should, but it remains true regardless of whether we notice it every single day in every single person. There is one further detail worth sharing before we allow this story to settle toward its close tonight, because it offers a kind of quiet grounding perspective on everything we have discussed. Researchers studying long-term human population trends note that, despite the severity of the bottleneck we explored, despite the repeated near failures of early dispersal attempts beyond Africa, despite every narrow, uncertain gamble layered across this entire deep history, the overall trajectory of human population viewed across the full span of our species' existence has been one of slow accumulating, eventually accelerating growth. From a population that may have numbered only in the low thousands at its narrowest point, humanity has grown across hundreds of thousands of years into a population now numbering in the billions, spread across every habitable continent and a great many environments that would have seemed entirely uninhabitable to the people whose story we have spent this evening tracing. That growth was never guaranteed. Nothing in this story has ever suggested otherwise. It happened because enough individual people across enough individual generations in enough individual moments of hardship and quiet decision continued forward rather than stopping. There is no dramatic singular reason for this. There is only the accumulated weight of an almost incomprehensible number of small ordinary acts of survival repeated patiently enough for long enough that they eventually became something as vast and improbable as the entire subsequent span of human history. We are nearly at the place in this story where everything we have traced this evening can finally settle into stillness, where the genetic threads, the stone tools, the slow recoveries, the failed and successful migrations, the layered mixing of separated relative, all of it can be allowed to rest together into something resembling a complete shape. Before that quiet settling begins, though, there remains one last image worth holding, one final way of looking at everything we have discussed tonight, a way of understanding not simply what happened to our ancestors, but what it might mean for how we understand ourselves lying here now, at the far end of a thread that by every reasonable measure should very easily have broken. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a story once you have followed it all the way to its edges. And I think we have reached that point now, you and I, somewhere deep in the night, with everything we have gathered laid out quietly between us. Let me bring it together gently the way you might gather scattered objects from a table at the end of a long evening, not hurrying, simply placing each one where it belongs. We began in a landscape that no longer exists, walked by people whose faces we will never see, whose names dissolved long before anyone thought to write such things down. We found them narrowed almost to nothing, a population so small that an entire species balanced for 100,000 years, on numbers a modern conservationist would consider a crisis. We found them enduring that narrowness not through any single act of heroism, but through an almost unimaginable accumulation of small, unremarkable choices repeated by thousands of unremembered people season after season, generation after generation. We found stone shaped with real skill fire, understood deeply enough to reshape rock itself, pigment ground, and used for reasons we will likely never fully know. We found the thread widening at last, scattered bands, finding their way back to one another, separate ancestries reuniting after staggering stretches of solitude. We found failure too, more failure than success, dispersals that ended in strainers, founding populations that simply did not continue, and then finally one that did narrow, as it was carrying forward into every corner of the world the same fragile, stubborn persistence that had carried it through everything before. And underneath all of it, running quietly through every part of this story, we found the same simple, almost unbearable truth. None of this had to happen. There was no guarantee at any point along this entire deep, narrow thread that it would continue. It could have ended in the African landscape we began with. It could have ended during any one of the failed attempts to leave that landscape behind. It could have ended in countless ways we will never know, about countless small groups whose stories simply stopped, leaving no trace for anyone to find. And yet somehow, across all of that uncertainty, across all of that genuine and repeated danger, it continued. Not inevitably, not because it was destined to, simply because again and again enough people in enough difficult moments kept going. I think this is the part of the story that reaches furthest beyond its own deep timeline into every other kind of history we might ever choose to tell on evenings like this one. Empires rise and call themselves permanent, and every one of them eventually falls. Civilizations believe themselves secure, and the ground beneath them shifts anyway. Power, when you study it closely enough across enough centuries, reveals itself again and again as something temporary, something borrowed, something far more fragile than it ever appears from the inside. But underneath all of that fragility, in every era, in every collapse, there remains something quieter and considerably more durable. Ordinary people doing ordinary things, choosing in small and largely invisible ways to continue. That persistence rarely makes it into the grand version of any historical account. It is not dramatic enough. It does not announce itself. But it is, when you look closely enough, the actual foundation beneath everything else, the thread that outlasts every empire built on top of it. There is one final detail I want to leave with you before we let this story rest, because I think it holds in a single small fact everything we have spent this evening trying to understand. Every human being alive today, regardless of where they were born, what language they speak, or how distant their lives might seem from one another, carries inside their own cells a faint, measurable trace of that ancient narrowing. The same signature, the same echo of scarcity, the same inherited memory of a population that nearly did not continue surfacing quietly in the genetic code of every person you have ever known, every person you will ever meet, every person who has ever lived since. It does not matter how different we appear to one another now. across the surface differences history loves to dwell on. Underneath all of it, we are still carrying the same thread pulled from the same narrow place held by the same quiet endurance. I find that thought settles something in me late at night more than almost anything else this kind of history has ever shown me. So let the rest of this evening be quiet. You do not need to remember every detail we have traced tonight. The bottleneck, the recovery, the failed migrations, the reunions across deep time. None of that needs to stay with you in the morning. What I hope stays instead is something simpler. A feeling more than a fact. Somewhere far back, almost beyond imagining, there were very few of us left. A small handful of people in a landscape long since changed beyond recognition, living through hardship they did not understand as historic because no one understands their own life as historic while they are living it. They did not know what would come after them, they simply continued. And because they continued, you are here now lying in the dark, carrying their unfinished story forward into one more quiet night. That is enough. Rest now.